Um, so hi everybody. I'm so glad you're here. I'm so excited for this next hour. If you are new to me and my work and Pregnant Together, I'll just do like a little brief introduction. My name is Maria Goodman. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a queer midwife and author and founder of Pregnant Together, which is a really awesome virtual community for queer folks and solo parents throughout trying to conceive pregnancy, postpartum, and parenting. And many folks are here today. And I'm so excited to have Camille Barton today. Camille and I met 12 years ago in Berkeley, and life has taken us different ways. But when I saw that they made this book, I was like, oh my God, like, just it's so essential to talk about grief and get some support in navigating grief through this family building time of life and through being a human in general. So I'm really honored to have Camille here and I'll let people in. I will moderate the chat. Like if folks have any questions or comments, I'll bring them to your attention, Camille. And other than that, yeah, you wanna take it away?
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's good to be with you all today. For those of you tuning in, yeah, I'm Camille Barton. I was raised in London, but I've been shaped by the Bay Area and Berlin. I'm currently now based in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands. I wear many hats, but I can describe myself as a writer, artist, and somatic practitioner that's interested in growing networks of care and livable futures. Sometimes also think of myself as a social imagineer, so trying to imagine and design new ways of relating that can support culture change. So I'm going to be speaking about some of the ideas in relation to my book that just came out, which is called Tending Grief, Embodied Rituals for Holding Our Sorrow and Growing Cultures of Care and Community. Yeah, Maria is just holding it up right now. Um, and this book is really centering communal grief, the different forms of collective grief that we experience and the benefits of being with grief in community so that we can reduce isolation, build trust, and ultimately get clear on what we care about so we can move towards that together. Um, I will say that despite being an author on this subject, I don't consider myself an expert in grief. I consider myself someone that's in active practice and experimenting with different approaches. There are some experiences I've had, and there are many experiences I'm yet to have. So I just want to be open about that's how I see myself in this work. And I'm really interested in hearing from you today, things that come up, things that resonate. Yeah. And in terms of a kind of working definition of grief, if that is supportive, I kind of think of grief as the emotions or sensations that arise in relation to loss or big life shifts that change the rhythm of our days. I think for me, it's important to not just have this association of grief with bereavement alone. Of course, that comes up when we lose people that we love, but grief can also arise in relation to losing homelands, in relation to the impacts of mental health on family members or loved ones and the ways that that changes them, or the context of our lives, um, friendships ending, various changes in our lives can create grief, and also many of the collective experiences that we associate with forms of oppression and harm as well. So I think it can be helpful to kind of expand in the notion of grief and give ourselves more permission to be in conversation with it as it arises in our lives in various ways. In terms of some things about me that can situate how I come to this work, I'm a gender fluid or non-binary being that is queer and has loved and been in relationship with people across the gender spectrum. I trained as a birth doula a long time ago when I was living in the Bay Area as part of Moni Efra Ross's volunteer doula program, SF General, and didn't attend any births actually. I kind of moved towards advocacy and thinking about birth justice and was involved in that for a couple of years. And I have been pregnant once and I had an abortion, which I'm going to speak more to in a moment. And I'm actively in a community with many queer parents, and I have a number of nibblings that I'm actively engaged with. So some of the experiences I'm going to speak to come from my direct lived experience, and others will be from people I'm in community with and the ways that grief has kind of been moving for them as queer parents who are also building families. So yeah, just want to lay that out and situate where I'm coming to this from. We're a kind of intimate group today, so feel free to share things in the chat if that feels good, share questions as they arise. I'm really happy to try and weave that in as we move through. In terms of a little orientation to the session today, I'm going to begin by inviting you all to join me in a embodied resourcing practice. You can participate if that feels good, or if you'd rather not, that's completely fine. Everything we do today is an invitation. I'm going to speak a little bit about my origin story in terms of having an abortion and the grief that came with that experience and led to developing embodied rituals around grief tending. And then I'm going to dive into a bit of the framing I use around grief and the ancestors and inspirations for this approach. I'm going to feel into the kind of trying to conceive and queer family building context and some of the grief that can come up in that process. I would very much love to hear and have you feed into this as well, of course, based on your own experiences. And we'll finish up the session with some examples of rituals you can try out and use that are also in the book. And there'll be space for questions at the end as well. So that's going to be the kind of rhythm for the session today. I would invite you as well to just take care of your body and your needs throughout. I know a number of you are doing this already, but if you want to be screen off, that's completely fine. If you need to stretch or hydrate, please take care of your needs throughout the session, whatever that looks like. So if you would like to join me in a little embodied resourcing practice, this will be about 3 to 5 minutes long, and it will be focusing on trying to find or track pleasant sensations in the body and being with that for a little while. So if you'd like to join me in this, I'd invite you to find a comfortable position. And you can close your eyes if that feels good, or you can gently rest your gaze somewhere in your space. And invite you to begin by just noticing any sensations arising in your body or your mind in this moment. And invite you to notice any places where your body feels supported in this moment. This might be the soles of your feet against the floor, your legs or your lower back if you're sat down in a chair. Just noticing these places where there is connection and support. And I invite you to scan your body and find a place that feels most pleasant right now. A place in your body that perhaps feels a little bit better than other places in your body without you having to do anything to it. And if you're someone that's experiencing physical pain in this moment, I'd invite you to find a place that feels neutral. But once you've found this place that feels most pleasant or neutral, the invitation is just to be with it for a few moments, noticing any ripples or shifts in sensation. And as you're doing this practice, if you feel tension or discomfort, you can just stop. But if this is feeling grounding or relaxing in some way, I invite you to notice what signals is your body giving you that demonstrates that this feels relaxing or grounding in some way. Just being with this for a couple more moments. So I'd invite you to maybe bring some movement into your fingers and your toes, and open your eyes if they were closed, and take any movement or stretching that feels good as you come back into the space. Okay. Thanks for trying that with me. Or if you felt like you needed to do something else, then thanks for honoring that for yourself too. So, in terms of little origin story for my entry point into grief and some of the subject matter we're discussing today. In 2017, I got pregnant for the first time as I was trying to leave a relationship. And there were many reasons why the situation didn't feel right in that moment. Although I loved being pregnant and I really desired to parent, after really sitting with it, I decided that having an abortion was the thing I needed to do, the choice that felt most aligned. So rationally, I was very clear. So I was pretty shocked by the amount of grief that came up for me after having an abortion. And yeah, I really felt that my kind of perception completely changed. Colors seemed less bright. I was incredibly heavy and exhausted for a long time. I wasn't interested in many of the things I had been. Everything in my kind of way of perceiving and moving through life was radically different. And I noticed that there wasn't really much space to be with grief or to process what was happening in my community. I couldn't really find support groups. There just was very little space to have conversations about this process. And even in the actual journey of deciding to have an abortion and looking for a queer or kind of trans-inclusive abortion doula, I couldn't find anyone in the region where I was living at the time, which was London. So even the way of kind of facilitating myself through that process couldn't happen as I would have liked, and there was also a lot of grief with that. So this grief also seemed to become connected and entangled with lots of other emotions as well. I started to feel a lot of rage, but the lack of space to be with grief, various forms of grief in our societies, in many of our societies in the West. And I felt that there was this subtle or sometimes not so subtle approach from people saying, well, you just need to go in a corner and deal with that on your own. You know, you just need to be in isolation with this. And that made me feel quite angry. And I think that anger kind of fueled me in a way to decide to really be with my experience and find and create the kind of containers I needed to be a companion to myself through this grief process, and not try and bypass it, but really allow it to unfold in the time it needed. And during that process, there was somewhat of a domino effect where lots of other forms of grief arose in that time. Things ranging from losing my apartment to a house fire, to having early childhood trauma and sexual abuse memories come back, and then having to navigate that. Just lots and lots of things in the last 6 or 7 years seem to ricochet from this initial entry point into grief. So it's been quite a immersive grief tornado in some ways in the last 6 or 7 years, not least with the pandemic, another form of collective grief. So I've really been quite in it and immersed in experimenting with tools to support my nervous system to be with these big sensations and build capacity for that over time, but also to have an approach that's very practice-based and a way for me to dip in consciously and dip out of the grief that's there and really allow it to be, something that I continue to tend to. In terms of a bit of a framing around this and some of the ideas, I guess, that underpin this sense of grief tending as a kind of ongoing practice, as I've already maybe mentioned, not in these terms, I think grief is still very taboo in the Western context. We don't really have many spaces to be with it. And as a result, there's quite a lot of isolation and shame that can arise for many of us when we're experiencing grief. I personally believe we need community for healing and for support. And so when we don't have that, I think we can tend to find ways to numb and move away from the feelings, the emotions that are coming up, that are crying out for support and attention. If those can't be met, then it's like, well, we need to get rid of this somehow. And we also need to meet our survival needs in capitalism. And so there's that pressure as well. And there are so many ways to numb in our societies. I think many of us, myself included, use substances. That's been a big part of my early life. But for some, it's shopping or social media or alcohol or whatever it may be. There are various ways to numb. And I think we're kind of encouraged to do that in a sense so that we can remain productive workers and sort of move away from whatever might encroach on that. So when I was looking for access points or support or people who could guide me towards rituals or ways to be with grief, two ancestors really stood out and have been a kind of guiding light for me. And I feel like my book really rests on their shoulders. And these two people are Malidoma Some and Sobonfu Some. And they are both no longer alive, but they're elders from the Dagara tribe. And the Dagara people are indigenous to Burkina Faso in West Africa. And Malidoma and Sobonfu actually spent a lot of time living in the States and spreading Dagara grief rituals in the US predominantly, but also some other parts of the Western world. I had the great experience of being able to go to one of Sobonfu's grief rituals when I was based in the Bay Area in around 2014 or 15 at Spirit Rock. And that was the first time I'd been in a kind of durational grief ritual context. I'm really, really grateful I was able to have that time with her in community. But there's some principles from the kind of Dagara way of thinking about grief that I deeply resonate with. The first one I want to share with you all is this notion that grief is a generative force. And so when we actually engage with it, when we're tending to it or in conversation, actually has benefits in our lives and also in our communities. So that's quite different maybe from how we see it in the West, where it can often be almost viewed as an inconvenience or something we just need to move through as quickly as possible or avoid. The Dagara also believe that unaddressed grief will actually become harm in the community in the form of violence or other social ills. And so traditionally, the Dagara will have a monthly grief ritual where everyone is expected to attend because, they feel that if people don't show up and do that, it will have ripple effects that will be very negative for the whole community. So it's really seen as a collective responsibility to be in regular practice and relationship to grief. And I suppose with that, there's a sense that when grief is untended generationally, then it also continues to create wounding and issues. And so Malidoma and many of his books will speak about the West having huge amounts of ancestral dirty laundry to tend to because people haven't been doing this work and it continues to ricochet in negative ways. He would also speak a lot in his writing about the lack of space for grief in the West really being a form of social control. So this idea that when we're numbing, when we're disconnected from what's really going on with us, We're easier to control. We're more placated, and that the state and repressive forces kind of capitalize on that, because then we have less agency and less ability to be clear on what we care about and what we're really trying to be in relationship to. And this, I think, was a driving force for why they wanted to create more approaches and tools within the Western context, because, yeah, they could see what the lack of space was doing in many ways. The last piece I'll name for now is in the Dogara context, they also see grief tending as something that's quite spiritual, that connects us to ancestors, that allows us to have ancestral wisdom and more clarity on kind of what our gifts are to share in the collective and what we really care about, what some would say, you can take this or leave this, but what some would say we are here in this time to do or to contribute to the web of life. So these ideas really, really resonate with me and kind of underpin a lot of how I think about grief tending and my own rhythm of having a monthly grief tending ritual, which has been the case for about the last 4 years or so, and really noticing what happens when I don't do that, or when I miss it, and when it, gets to about 5 or 6 weeks and starting to have quite particular things arise for me, and noticing, okay, it's time to go back to this. I think for me, what I notice in the Western context is because we are numbing so much to kind of function and just engage in the conditions many of us have to engage with, doing a kind of durational embodied grief ritual might not work for everyone. It might be quite overwhelming. So what I'm advocating for in the book and in my practice generally is almost building up the capacity over time to be with bigger sensations, and doing that by actually pairing all the grief rituals with embodied resourcing practices, or nervous system regulation tools is another way of saying it. So really allowing us to begin by kind of connecting to our bodies and trying to notice if we are becoming overwhelmed. And if that's the case, then the invitation is always to pause, notice what we need, which might be to hydrate or go for a walk, or maybe using another embodiment tool and go back into the ritual, but really trying to emphasize tracking what's happening in our system so that we're not kind of dissociating, we're not leaving our bodies, we're building that capacity to be with what's there and kind of consciously dipping into it and dipping out of it when it's too much. As my friend Farzana would say, almost like titrating grief. So not kind of this dynamic of either not feeling anything or being completely flooded, but trying to find a way to be with more over time and to be intentionally with it or stepping out. So that's where it differs a little bit from the Dogara approach, where collectively they're used to having these very beautiful, embodied, durational ritual processes. This is almost a way of trying to support where many of us are, who don't have those ancestral practices necessarily so accessible at the moment. And I noticed for me in these years of experimentation that grief tending is definitely allowing me to kind of orient to my own life more and to what's happening in the collective, and generally be more responsive than reactive. Doesn't mean that I don't feel anger or various emotions. I definitely do, and I think they're important, but more just having a little bit more space before going into automatic, unconscious behaviors that maybe were a bit more commonplace before. I also feel like I'm experiencing a fuller range of emotions and ultimately getting more clear on what matters to me and how I can move towards that with other people I'm in community with. And so my hope is that in various capacities, grief tending can support our social movements, can support us in our communities and in our relationships to have more intimacy and more care, where given that so many of us seem to be going through it right now, I really hope it can be supportive in that capacity. So I've been chatting for a while now, so I want to just pause and invite any reflections or if there's any questions that are coming up. Yeah, I'm really happy to hear anything that's moving for you all. And if you're someone that would rather type in the chat, that's completely fine. Whatever feels good for you.
I'll just share that I really love the piece about like how grief can be a window into showing up more fully in our lives and just like what a generative healing framework that is and that I've experienced in myself like when we open to these what we often experience in our culture is like hard emotions. It actually gives us more access to like the pleasures and joys as well.
Mm. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Okay, I'm gonna move us on, but feel free if there are things coming up or things you want to put in the chat, I will circle back. Um, okay, so this is, of course, a session that's really considering the queer family context. So trying to conceive pregnancy, postpartum, and parenting, and all of the kind of intersections that come with that. Um, I notice in my own life and in the lives of my queer kin around me, there can be a lot of grief in just being a queer person in general in the world at this time. And I also notice for queer parents and also parents that aren't queer, and the context of pregnancy and parenting is also something that can be a grief heavy space. So I think there can be a lot here. And I'm going to outline some things, but I want to name that this isn't an exhaustive list. If there are things you also want to share from your experience, then please feed that in. Um, but some of the things I've witnessed and could name around potential griefs around this area, um, I think financial barriers in various aspects are quite a big one. I mean, in many contexts, queer and trans folks are not necessarily accessing resource, being barred from accessing resource, I should say, in many contexts. And although, thanks to the work of Maria and many people trying to make queer conception more accessible, things like IVF are still incredibly expensive and inaccessible for many folks, as well as just legal provisions to put in place for queer family building. And these things can mean that people have to maybe wait a lot later in life and might run into things around fertility as a result of that. So even in that sense, there's a lot just there, as well as having to find the right donor, or for some folks finding surrogates or people to carry, having to have support and other people in the mix where, you know, hetero couples don't necessarily need to do that. And I think there can be a lot there in the journey of witnessing friends approaching family members or certain friends and having conversations, a lot of intention and energy to see if it's a right fit, and sometimes are not working out. And there being a lot of grief in that as well, in trying to find the right alignment and configuration, that not necessarily always being ideal for people. Then there's the dynamics of miscarriage, you know, and trying to conceive and getting pregnant, the excitement of that, and then the very real grief that arises for people who miscarry. I have many friends who have had multiple miscarriages, and the process for them to move through their grief and feel resourced enough to try again, and then having the nervousness and anxiety around what might happen, are very big things to move through. And there's, just as there isn't much space around abortion, there's very little space for support around people who have miscarriages, and potentially less so for folks who are queer or trans. as generally there are less resources and support within the medicalized context for queer parents, for folks trying to conceive who don't conform to the binary that is very much imposed in many of our societies. With all of this, there can be a lot of feelings of isolation and very understandable responses to microaggressions or misgendering or harm when accessing support in medical spaces and institutions, when going for checkups. One of my closest friends, really had to kind of educate that whole like birthing team through the National Health Service in England. So I mean, it is free, and that's a huge thing, especially given the US context. But still having to do a lot of labor to educate their support team as a trans birth giver about what it meant for them to feel supported and held in that process. And not everyone necessarily has the energy for that. And that also takes a lot. And just to name a couple more things, I think, yeah, anticipating the world that we're birthing children into in this time. And, so many of the anti-trans, anti-queer policies that are being enacted, not just in the US, but around the world, are very real fears and considerations. I think for parents and queer people just existing more broadly in this time. And the last couple of things I'll name as well is many people in my life, seem to dream of parenting in a communal context, but then are often faced with the reality of that not necessarily working out, people not being ready at the time where they're planning their families or having their children, and finding themselves more isolated than they would like, or solo parenting, or in maybe more of a nuclear family dynamic, and this not being what they would have desired, and having to be with the grief of that, the love they have for their children, their families, but ultimately not parenting and raising kids in the ways that they would have visioned. I think is a very ongoing story in my communities at the moment. And then what it means to navigate the school system, nursery, engaging with other parents who, may not understand or potentially be hostile to you as a queer family, and really trying to find other queer parents and community so that there can be more support and more care and less isolation. There are lots of other things I could name, and many others that you might have experienced or be experiencing that I haven't named. But I just wanted to give a snapshot of some of the different facets and dynamics that can arise in this journey that many of you are on or have been on. And I hope that, yeah, rather than feeling you kind of have to deal with this on your own in silence, I hope that there could be a permission to be with this and to kind of see these things as legitimate forms of grief, because yeah, they take a toll and they're very real dynamics, and so yeah, I just want to kind of invite that, this giving of permission to be with the grief that can be arising in this experience, even if there are lots of other emotions of joy and pleasure and excitement and awe and wonder, but that grief may still be there and may still benefit from being tended to in some way. So in terms of what this could look like, I want to preface this by saying that there are lots of different ways to approach grief, and many fantastic books out there. I have a whole list in the back of Ending Grief of texts that have inspired me, and a few that also have great rituals. Thing that brings me towards a ritual as a way to make space and make a container for grief is that I find emotions are often not rational, and yet we live in contexts where we're often taught to rationalize and pick apart and analyze our feelings and try to kind of resolve them through that. And sometimes for some people that can work well, or we can develop a story about what's happening and say, oh, well, here's the story. So I'm going to just avoid the felt sense of where this lands in my body. But for many of us, we might have the story and might have analyzed it, and yet there are still these heavy feelings, and we can feel the grief in our bodies and want to find some way to shift or move that. So for me, ritual has become a really powerful container to make meaning and move through feelings in a more holistic way. Where symbolic meaning can be made through the ritual process, but there's a way that there can be a shifting of the grief, of the heaviness in the body and on a felt sense level. So it's not just a kind of rationalizing, but something that creates a shift, even if it's small at first, but there's movement and more space that's created. So some examples which could potentially be helpful to try out, depending on your experiences. In the book, there is a ritual or a kind of somewhat ritual / altar making process for folks who have experienced pregnancy loss. So this could be intentional or unintentional, but any form of pregnancy loss, engaging with some kind of altar making or shrine making process, for me personally, was very supportive. To have a space where I could go and share memories or share what was coming up for me, light a candle next to this being and kind of honor the impact that they've had on my life, having on my life. It's not necessary to add this in, but I think naming rituals can also be really beautiful. I know from a kind of family constellations perspective, for those of you that might not know family constellations, it's kind of a way of processing challenges and family dynamics that has been popularized in the West, but actually was really taken from South African indigenous practices. But one of the principles within family constellations is this kind of line of ancestors. And so they very much advocate for naming rituals after pregnancy loss so that there's a kind of space for this being within a family context and line. So if it feels supportive, having a naming ritual and then having a shrine with the name of this being and a space that is there for them might be something that you might want to engage with or try out. Another practice that I think is kind of my baseline grief practice at the moment is a ritual called the grief jar. And I learned about this through Trisha Hersey, who created the NAP ministry, and I just adapted it a little bit with her permission, and that's now Intending Grief. But this ritual is very simple. You can get any kind of jar with a lid and place it on your altar if you have an altar, or just somewhere in your home that you see regularly. And you can cut up small pieces of paper, put it next to the jar with a pen. And when you feel a moment of grief arise, or something comes up that maybe you don't have time to deal with in that moment, you can just write it on the piece of paper and put it in the jar, almost like, okay, I'm going to come back to you. And then at the frequency of your choice, I like to do it monthly, usually around the full moon. You can set up a ritual for yourself. So starting with an embodied practice and then taking time to go through each piece of paper and really be with it. Notice what's happening in the body, noticing the sensations, having any form of catharsis that feels good, whether this is crying, moaning, any kind of rocking, whatever the body wants to do to kind of be with that. And then when you're ready to kind of let it go, allow it to shift, you can drop it into a basin of water, or if you have access to a fire in your home, you could also give it to the fire. And this is, one of my favorites, just because with the demands of daily life, many of us don't have time or capacity to be with and process every form of grief that comes up. But knowing that we're putting it somewhere that we're going to come back to it, I think can be really helpful to just be intentionally making space, even if it's just once a month, to be with that. And I think the kind of processing ritual can really be anywhere from 20 minutes to sometimes I take an hour and a half, depending on if I have space and time. But yeah, that's one that I really, really enjoy. Another practice from the book that might be helpful to those of you who enjoy dancing or movement is called Dance Your Grief. And so this is just an invitation to use dance as a way to notice where there might be heaviness or blockages associated with grief, and to just be in movement with that, to notice how does this part want to be held or want to be moved? Is there catharsis that comes when I give myself space for that? And just kind of it's an access point really to explore. If especially if you're someone that knows that dance is a therapeutic or kind of soothing practice for you, then that might be a great access point to explore. There are many more rituals in the book, some for kind of individual use and many for kind of communal or group spaces as well. I really hope that we will all have access to more community spaces for grief tending in the years to come. And I'm also aware that we're not there yet. And sometimes having a personal practice can just be the thing that sustains being in relationship to what's coming up. And hopefully, if more people with personal practices come together, there can be experimentation towards kind of communal space holding. Um, I should also say that in the book, there are various herbal medicine recommendations as well that can support with grief. For many of us, if we are experiencing loss and there's a lot coming up, there can be racing thoughts, it can be really hard to sleep sometimes. So there are some examples of herbs like passion flower, valerian, that can be really supportive to help with sleep. And there's also a blend in there to support with womb recovery after pregnancy loss as well, that I've used personally as my body was recovering after an abortion, as well as other herbs that are supportive for the heart, the lungs. So I think that using whatever supports we can when we're grieving can be really helpful. Just finding a kind of a toolkit of different things that can help us kind of be as present as possible with what we're moving through, because it can be a lot. Yeah. So again, I've been talking for quite a while. So I'm gonna make some space now. We're in the last sort of 15 minutes or so of the session. If there are any questions or reflections that you have, again, this could be in the chat or this could be unmuting yourselves, and I would love to hear whatever is coming up for you, or answer any questions you have to the best of my ability.
Hi, Camille. This is Marina Farrell, or Marina, and I just want to give you appreciation. I came on a little late, but I'm so sad because everything you're sharing is so important. So I just wanted to just say thank you, and I'm super excited to get your book. I've already ordered it, so I can't wait to read it.
Thank you. I'm glad it resonated. Yeah.
Hi there. My name is Joe, and thank you so much for this talk. Yeah, my partner and I have been trying to conceive for over a year, and I think what I'm finding is that the grief of each cycle not working is kind of impacting like the hope that I can then feel in the next time we try, that I feel a bit like blocked from that hope now, because I want to like protect myself from that next cycle of grief that likely that might come. Yeah, and so just wanting to put that out there and hear if you had anything to say about that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think that's really valid, and I'm appreciate that you brought that in, because I think that's an experience that many people share as well in this process trying to conceive. Um, it depends on your relationship to ritual, because I know we also have various different relationships with spirituality or religion, and a lot of them are negative. So I don't want to assume what makes sense for you, but um, potentially creating a ritual that would feel good for you, whatever configuration, after each cycle, to try and clear or just honor that cycle and almost make a bit of space between the next attempt, the next part of the journey, might be helpful in creating a little bit more space for it to be a new experience, instead of having all of the kind of build up of what's happened before, then sort of piggybacking onto every next time you're trying in the journey. Um, so that might be something to explore if that feels aligned. Just finding ways to make space and clear the very valid emotions and things that are coming up, but really honoring them and being with that, so that there can hopefully be a little bit more spaciousness and potential and possibility for hope um, as you continue on the journey. I don't know if that resonates, but that's what's kind of coming up for me.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. I think like what we've been doing now is kind of just uh like kind of doing some of the like comfort rituals like and thing especially, and also like kind of like taking the opportunity to indulge in some of the things that like we wouldn't be able to do while pregnant. So like having a nice beer, or like taking a really long hot bath or whatever. But I like the idea of, yeah, I don't know, because right now that feels like more just like kind of like a self-soothe. Um, but maybe turning that more into like something more intentional and something more like a ritual. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for sharing. Mm. Thank you. I'm just going to read this share in the chat. So I'm just going to not name you, not because I don't want to name you, but just for privacy. So this person has said, thanks for naming those different reasons for grief many of us in the community experience. I came because I experienced some specific types of loss and am, but resonated with many other things you said. Sometimes it's just important to name things and call them grief. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I think that, yeah, so much of it in myself is often just giving myself the permission to feel like I can be with what's there, and actually validating that I can be allowed to have feelings about it. Because I think many of us are kind of coerced into not expressing our feelings or being able to share what's coming up. So I think a big part of it is, yeah, as you say, just being able to name this is grief and it's here, and it doesn't have to disappear tomorrow, and I don't have to be pathologized because of it. Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that.
I'm just having a thought come up that I would love to just offer and share with the group. And, I think there's a way as we set this intention to grow our families and welcome, a little human in the world, like even if they are not here with us yet, like we love them with a tenderness that is also an invitation to approach ourselves with in this grief process. And I feel like as parents or potential parents, like we can access that love and tenderness that we can feel for our children, for our own like inner children. And as someone who's have been going through a big transition and grief process in my own life too, like just that gentleness and tenderness, if I can like approach myself with that, there's a deep soothing that happens there. And I think it could be even in the grief, even when we like, if the trying to conceive process is taking a long time, like we are doing this because we love these potential babies of ours, and that's like there's healing energy in that for our own selves.
Thank you. It's beautiful. Mm. Any other questions or reflections that folks have?
Hi, this is Suze. I don't know. I was like attending this more as like a practitioner side of it, of like, what can I gain to like help my clients? I'm a midwife. Um, but like, I think the thing that's been like glaring at me throughout this is like my personal grief. That's like, okay, think it's time to pay attention to, but that like I came out after having my kids, and transitioned after having my kids and after being divorced. And so there's like a whole new grief for me around like going through that, the huge transition of like pregnancy and birth and early postpartum, um with like a former partner and with like a former version of myself. And like, even though I know that those things really helped me get to, more of the core of who I am now, it's still like, I had a lot of like feelings, I don't know, like a year or two ago where I was like, I just want to like do it all over again. Like I want to have babies again so that I can like go through that in this body and this like iteration of myself. But yeah, thank you for like all that you're sharing, because it is like allowing a mirror to be held up of some things that I personally need to sit with. So thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, and that's a big one that I did not name, but the grief of former versions of ourselves, which we often also don't have a lot of space to be with, because we have to be like, not have to, but many of us feel we have to just look at the bright side and take stock of what's here. And that's great, of course, but there can be a lot of pain with, yeah, what we have to let go of, or what changes as we shift in different ways. So yeah, I really hear that. And I hope you can give yourself some space to be with that as well. Yeah. I'm going to read this message in the chat. Good to see you, Camille. Thanks so much for sharing all this richness. I love what you shared about creating monthly grief rituals, and how if you skip a month, you begin to feel it showing up in your life. I'm excited to dig into the other rituals and resources in your book. Thank you. Yeah, I have the deep desire to start going to like community grief rituals in Amsterdam. So I'm thinking a lot about how to seed that and yeah, link more with other practitioners and get that going, because it's fine doing it on my own, but I really want to do it with people. So that's the next step, hopefully. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Camille. This has been so wonderful, and I'm just really honored and excited to include this as a resource for folks in the Pregnant Together community. And I will share the recording with everybody who signed up, whether or not they're in the community. Yeah, Camille, do you want to share your contact information or any ways that we can stay in touch with you and your work?
Sure, yeah. I will um post my it's good to post. I'll post my Instagram for now, which has links to Substack. So if you're someone who loves newsletters, then you can also sign up for that. There's about between 1 and 2 a month from me. And Instagram also has links to purchase the book in case you'd like to do that as well, and links to my website if you want to get in touch for anything else. So I'll just post that in here now. Yeah.
And I'll share that too with everybody who registered, and I'll post it when I share the recording.
Great. Thanks so much, y'all. I really appreciate all the sharing and your presence. And yeah, thank you, Maria, for having me.
Thank you so much. So good to see you. And yeah, take care. Take care, everybody. And see you in community.
Thanks. Bye.